April 1945, Okinawa. 3,000 Japanese soldiers raised their swords and charged into the darkness, screaming Banzai, convinced their warrior spirit would shatter the American lines. Within 90 seconds, American artillery was firing 43 shells per second, turning the battlefield into a mathematical equation of obliteration. But here's what they discovered when they became prisoners that shattered everything they'd been taught about strength, sacrifice, and why they really lost the war. Would you have believed what your enemy told you was a lie? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. April 1945. The island of Okinawa sat like a jagged wound in the Pacific Ocean, caught between two worlds at war. For Lieutenant Hiroshi Takeda, 24 years old and already tired beyond his years, this rocky ridge represented the final line between victory and defeat. He stood in a shallow trench, his boots caked in red mud, watching the sun sink toward the western horizon. Below him, stretched across the coastal plains like a steel blanket, sat the American Marine Invasion Force. Their ships dotted the harbor. Their trucks moved in endless columns along roads they had built in days. Their tents covered the landscape like a second invasion of canvas and rope. Japan was losing. Everyone knew it, though no one dared say it aloud. The political situation back home had become desperate. The military junta that ruled from Tokyo refused to even whisper the word surrender. Instead, they spoke of divine wind, of spiritual strength, of one final glorious stand that would turn the tide. They told the soldiers that their emperor was watching, that their ancestors demanded courage, that death in battle was the highest honor a man could achieve. These words had once filled Takeda with pride. Now, they just made him feel cold. The economic reality was impossible to ignore. Rice rations had been cut again last week. Each soldier received one small bowl per day, sometimes mixed with sawdust to make it stretch further. There was no sugar, no medicine beyond what they could capture from enemy aid stations. Ammunition was counted like gold coins. Artillery shells were saved for only the most critical moments. Takeda's company had started the campaign with 230 men. They were down to 190, and not a single replacement had arrived. There were no replacements left to send. The technological gap was even worse. Takeda had attended the Imperial Army Academy, where instructors taught that modern weapons were a crutch for weak soldiers. A true warrior needed only his rifle, his bayonet, and his unbreakable spirit. The sword his grandfather had carried in the Russo-Japanese War hung at his side, polished and sharp. It was supposed to be a symbol of samurai heritage, of Japan's ancient warrior tradition continuing into the modern age. But when American planes flew overhead, dozens at a time, flying in perfect formation, that sword felt very small. Japan's factories were being bombed into rubble. The supply ships that once brought food and bullets to the front lines now sat at the bottom of the ocean, torpedoed by American submarines that prowled the waters like hungry sharks. Every convoy that tried to reach Okinawa lost half its ships. The men on this ridge were cut off, and they knew it. They were an army that ran on willpower alone, because everything else had run out. Sergeant Kenji Yamamoto approached through the trench, moving with the careful steps of a man who had survived too many battles to take chances. At 31, he was ancient by infantry standards. He had fought in China since 1937, back when Japan's armies seemed unstoppable. He had seen friends die in 100 different ways. The younger soldiers looked up to him because he knew how to stay alive. But Yamamoto carried a secret doubt deep in his chest, a whisper that grew louder every day. The tactics they were being ordered to use were going to get everyone killed. "Lieutenant," Yamamoto said quietly, offering a crisp salutation, "the men are ready. We have counted bayonets and prepared the headbands." Takeda nodded. Tonight was the night. The orders had come down from division headquarters that morning. A massive Banzai charge, 3,000 men from multiple units, all attacking at once under cover of darkness. The plan was simple and terrible. Overwhelm the American positions through sheer numbers and ferocity. Break their will. Send them running back to their ships. The orders promised that one committed Japanese soldier could defeat 10 Americans. All they needed was courage. Private First Class Toshiro Nakamura was sharpening his bayonet nearby, the scraping sound of metal on stone rhythmic and endless. He was 19 years old, but looked younger, his face still round with the softness of youth. He came from a farming family in Kyushu, where his father grew rice in the same fields his grandfather had worked. Toshiro had been drafted at 17, pulled from his village with 20 other boys and handed a rifle. The army had taught him to march, to shoot, to obey orders without question. They had taught him that the emperor was divine, that dying for Japan was the most beautiful thing a man could do. They had not taught him what it felt like to be truly afraid. His hands shook as he worked the blade. Yamamoto noticed and sat down beside him. "First charge?" the sergeant asked. Nakamura nodded, not trusting his voice. "Keep your head low when we start moving," Yamamoto said. "Stay close to the man in front of you. If someone falls, do not stop. Just keep running forward. That is all you can do." The private wanted to ask if they would win. He wanted to ask if the charge would actually work, if 3,000 men with bayonets could really push back an army that had crossed an ocean. But those questions were dangerous. Asking them meant doubting. Doubting meant cowardice. So he just nodded and kept sharpening his blade. As twilight deepened into darkness, the officers moved through the trenches, giving final instructions. Takeda gathered his company and spoke the words he had been taught to say. He told them about glory, about honor, about the divine protection that would guide their charge. He told them that American soldiers were soft, raised in comfort, terrified of real combat. He promised them that when 3,000 screaming warriors emerged from the darkness with cold steel, the enemy would break and run. Some of the men believed him. Others just stared with hollow eyes, clutching their rifles and thinking about home. A few wrote final letters by candlelight, though there was no way to mail them. The letters would be found on their bodies, if their bodies were found at all. What none of them could see, what Takeda himself did not know, was happening in the valley below. The American Marines were not soft. They were not terrified. They were busy. Radio operators were coordinating with artillery battalions spread across 3 miles of coastline. Forward observers were studying maps with flashlights covered in red cloth, marking coordinates and calculating firing solutions. Ammunition trucks were unloading crate after crate of shells, stacking them beside howitzers that squatted in the darkness like sleeping metal beasts. The Americans knew the charge was coming. Their intelligence officers had intercepted radio traffic. Their scouts had watched the Japanese positions all day, noting the unusual activity. They had fought Banzai charges before, on other islands, and they had learned how to respond. Not with fear, with mathematics. 324 artillery pieces were being positioned. Each gun had a crew that had trained together for months, men who could load and fire with mechanical precision. Each howitzer was capable of firing 8 shells per minute when conditions were right. Tonight, conditions would be perfect. The fire control officers had divided the battlefield into a grid, numbered squares that could be targeted instantly based on observer reports. Radio communications meant adjustments could happen in seconds, not minutes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Japanese were preparing to fight with the tactics of their grandfathers, men charging with sharp steel, courage against fear, spirit against flesh. The Americans were preparing to fight with the tactics of their factories, coordinated machinery, overwhelming firepower, and industrial warfare brought to its logical conclusion. At midnight, Takeda checked his watch. 2 more hours. The men tied white headbands around their foreheads, cloth strips printed with slogans about victory and death. Some carried photographs of their families tucked into pockets. Others had small charms from Shinto shrines back home. Takeda touched the sword at his side one more time, feeling the worn handle his grandfather had gripped 4 decades earlier during a different war against a different enemy. He did not know that across the valley, American artillerymen were making final checks on their weapons. He did not know that radio operators were testing their frequencies one last time. He did not know that the ammunition stockpiles contained more explosive power than his entire division could fire in a year of constant combat. At 2 in the morning, the order came. Officers drew their swords. 3,000 men rose from their positions, a human wave stretching across the darkness. Someone shouted the words that had been shouted on 100 battlefields, Ten no Heika Banzai, long live the Emperor. The cry was taken up by thousands of throats, a roar of defiance and desperation that split the night. They began to run forward, bayonets gleaming in the starlight, believing that courage would be enough. For 200 meters, it almost felt like victory. They were moving fast, surging down the slope, the enemy positions growing closer with every step. Some men truly believed they would reach the American lines, that they would drive the invaders back into the sea. Then the night caught fire, and everything they believed turned to ash. The first shell landed 50 meters ahead of Lieutenant Takeda, and for a brief moment he thought it was just one explosion, a single gun firing in panic. Then the second shell hit, and the third, and the fourth. Then the world became nothing but fire and noise and the ground shaking so hard it felt like the earth itself was trying to throw them off. This was not normal artillery fire. This was not the scattered shooting Takeda had experienced in previous battles, where enemy guns fired a few rounds and then went quiet to save ammunition. This was something completely different. The shells came in waves that never stopped, explosions overlapping each other so fast there was no silence between them. It was like standing inside a thunderstorm where the lightning never ended, where each flash was followed immediately by another and another and another. Takeda had run perhaps 200 steps when he realized his men were dying faster than they could move forward. To his left, an entire squad vanished in a curtain of dirt and flame. To his right, soldiers were thrown into the air like broken dolls. The careful formation they had started with dissolved into chaos. Men scattered, trying to find cover that did not exist. The artillery shells were landing in patterns, organized grids of destruction that marched across the battlefield with mechanical precision. At 2 in the morning, they dove behind a low stone wall, his ears ringing so loud he could barely hear his own breathing. 3 other soldiers huddled next to him, their faces covered in mud and blood. One was screaming, but no sound came out, or maybe Takeda just couldn't hear it over the constant roar of explosions. He tried to count the seconds between impacts, the way he had been trained, but there were no seconds. The shells fell continuously, without pause, a rain of metal that never stopped. Through the smoke and dust, Sergeant Yamamoto appeared, crawling on his pelly. His uniform was torn and his left arm hung at a wrong angle, but he was still moving. He pressed his face close to Takeda's ear and shouted something. Takeda couldn't hear the words, but he understood the gesture. They had to keep moving, or they would die here. They rose and ran again, zigzagging through the explosions. Yamamoto was trying to rally what remained of his squad, waving them forward, but the artillery followed them like it knew where they were going. And that's when Takeda noticed something that made his blood turn cold. The explosions were moving with them. As the Japanese soldiers advanced, the shells adjusted, landing ahead of them, beside them, cutting off every path forward. It was like the American gunners could see in the dark, like they knew exactly where every man was running. What Takeda did not know was that American forward observers were watching through infrared scopes, calling coordinates into radios, and artillery officers were adjusting fire in real time. The Japanese were still using runners to carry messages between units, boys sprinting through gunfire with paper orders in their hands. The Americans were using radio waves that traveled at the speed of light. Private Nakamura fell into a shell crater and found himself surrounded by pieces of men he had eaten breakfast with that morning. His mind could not process what he was seeing. He had been told that the Japanese fighting spirit was superior, that courage could overcome any obstacle. But there was no way to be brave against this. The artillery did not care if you were courageous or cowardly. It just killed everyone equally, grinding flesh and bone into the mud without mercy. He looked over the edge of the crater and saw something that broke his understanding of war completely. In the distance, behind the American lines, truck headlights were moving in long columns. Not one or two trucks, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They were bringing supplies forward, endless streams of vehicles on roads that had not existed a week ago. The Americans were being resupplied faster than they could shoot. While Japanese soldiers carried ammunition on their backs, walking for days through jungle trails, the enemy had built highways and filled them with trucks. Nakamura watched one truck stop near an artillery position. Men unloaded crate after crate of shells, stacking them in neat piles. There seemed to be no end to the boxes. The gun crews worked like factory workers, loading and firing with smooth repetition, no wasted motion. 8 shells per minute from each gun, someone had calculated later. 8 shells every 60 seconds, fired with the regularity of a clock ticking. 324 guns firing 8 shells per minute. Nakamura did not know these numbers, could not have done the math even if someone told him. But he could see the result. 43 shells every single second, raining down on a front that was only half a kilometer wide. The mathematics of it were impossible. The Japanese artillery, what little remained, had perhaps 15 guns total. The Americans had brought more than 300. Yamamoto crawled next to Nakamura and grabbed his shoulder. The sergeant's eyes were different now, something broken behind them that had nothing to do with physical wounds. He pointed at the truck convoy and then at their own positions, where soldiers carried shells one at a time on their shoulders. No words were needed. The contrast spoke louder than any speech. They tried to advance again. Perhaps 1,000 men were still moving forward, maybe less. The charge had become a desperate scramble for survival. Some soldiers still screamed the emperor's name, still believing that reaching the enemy lines would bring victory. Others just ran, because running felt better than dying in place. Takeda's sword bounced against his hip as he ran, suddenly feeling like a child's toy, a museum piece brought to a slaughter. His grandfather had used this blade to fight Russians in 1905, when wars were still won by men with sharp steel and strong hearts. But this was not that kind of war. This was a war of factories and supply chains, of radio coordination and mechanical efficiency. The Americans were not fighting with courage or cowardice. They were fighting with systems, with industrial power turned into organized destruction. An explosion lifted Takeda off his feet and threw him backward. He landed hard, the wind knocked from his lungs, stars dancing in his vision. When he could breathe again, when he could see again, he realized the charge had failed. Men were retreating, running back toward their own lines, the attack broken beyond repair. Of the 3,000 who had started, only scattered groups remained, stumbling through the darkness, trying to find their way home. Takeda sat in the mud, his ears still ringing, watching American flares drift slowly down on tiny parachutes, turning night into artificial day. In that harsh light, he saw abandoned equipment scattered across the battlefield, Japanese rifles, helmets, swords, dropped by officers who had finally accepted that steel blades were useless against artillery that fired faster than a human heart could beat. The ideology that had sustained him through years of war began to crack, not broken yet, but fractured. They had been taught that spirit conquers all, that one Japanese soldier equals 10 Americans, that willingness to die was the ultimate weapon. But spirit could not answer artillery that fired 8 times per minute from 300 guns. Courage could not defeat an enemy that built roads overnight and supplied their armies with endless trucks. Yamamoto appeared beside him, helping him stand. The sergeant's face was expressionless, but his hands shook. Together, they walked back toward their lines, leaving 2,000 bodies behind them in the darkness. Neither man spoke. There were no words for what they had just learned about modern war. 3 days after the failed charge, Lieutenant Takeda sat in what remained of his company's position, counting the survivors. 87 men answered roll call from the original 230. The rest were dead, wounded beyond help, or simply missing in the churned earth where the artillery had fallen. The survivors moved like ghosts, their eyes empty, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all. Something fundamental had broken inside them, something that orders and discipline could not repair. The morning brought American aircraft, dropping leaflets instead of bombs. The papers fluttered down like snow, covering the trenches in white. Officers screamed orders to burn them unread, to not pollute their minds with enemy lies. But Takeda picked one up anyway, his hands moving before his brain could stop them. He told himself he needed to know what propaganda the Americans were spreading, that understanding enemy tactics was part of his duty. But really, he just wanted to understand what had killed his men. The leaflet showed a diagram of an American artillery factory. The Rock Island Arsenal, it said, produced 2 million shells every month. Takeda read the number 3 times, certain he had misunderstood. 2 million shells in 1 month. Japan's entire annual production was less than half that number. The paper showed photographs of assembly lines, machines stamping out shell casings faster than human hands could count, workers in clean factories with electric lights and safety equipment. It looked like science fiction, like a fantasy of what manufacturing might become in some distant future. Except it was real, and it was happening now, while Japanese factories were being reduced to rubble by American bombs. He folded the leaflet and hid it in his jacket, though possessing enemy propaganda could get him executed. Sergeant Yamamoto saw, but said nothing. The old rules seemed meaningless now. That afternoon, scouts reported finding an abandoned American position a kilometer to the south. The Marines had moved forward so quickly they had left supplies behind. Takeda took a patrol to investigate, more out of curiosity than any tactical purpose. What they found changed everything. The position was a small observation post, hastily dug but already reinforced with sandbags and wooden frames. But it was what the Americans had left behind that made Takeda's men stop and stare. Wooden crates were stacked in neat rows, some open, some still sealed. Inside were sea rations, metal tins with food already cooked and preserved. Takeda opened one with his bayonet. Beef stew, real meat in thick gravy, corn, crackers wrapped in wax paper, instant coffee in waterproof packets. His men had not seen meat in 4 months. Their rice rations were mixed with tree bark to make them last. There were cartons of cigarettes, American brands with colorful packaging. Takeda's soldiers smoked whatever they could find, usually harsh tobacco rolled in newspapers. These cigarettes came in soft packs, 20 to a box, the tobacco fresh and mild. Someone found a discarded field jacket and held it up. The fabric was thick and well made, with a zipper instead of buttons, lined with material that would actually keep a man warm. It was better quality than the dress uniform Takeda had worn to his graduation from the academy. Private Nakamura discovered something that made him laugh, a sound so unexpected that everyone turned to look. He held up a magazine, pages in full color, showing American women in bathing suits. The magazine was dated 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks! That meant these frontline soldiers, fighting in the mud of Okinawa, received mail faster than Japanese headquarters received orders from Tokyo. The infrastructure that could deliver magazines to a combat zone while still fighting a war was beyond anything the Japanese military could imagine. But it was the chocolate bar that broke Takeda completely. A simple Hershey bar, still in its brown wrapper, printed in 4 colors with fancy letters. He held it in his hand, feeling the weight of it, staring at the wrapper. Japan was recycling every scrap of paper for the war effort, using old newspapers to wrap ammunition, burning books to stay warm. America was printing candy wrappers in full color and giving them to soldiers as casual snacks. The contrast was so enormous that his mind struggled to accept it. Yamamoto sat down heavily on a crate, his face gray. He had been fighting since 1937 and had believed in Japan's divine destiny for nearly a decade. Now he spoke the words that everyone was thinking, but no one dared say aloud. We were told Americans are soft, weak, obsessed with comfort and luxury. He gestured at the supplies scattered around them, at the evidence of American abundance. This is what their comfort builds. While we glorified suffering and called it strength, they built this. The words hung in the air like confession. Takeda wanted to argue, to defend everything he had been taught, to explain that spiritual power was superior to material wealth. But the explanation died in his throat. He had charged American lines with a sword while they responded with artillery that fired 8 shells per second. He had watched his men die hungry while American soldiers ate beef stew from tins and received chocolate in the mail. The mathematics were too clear to deny. That night, Takeda sat alone and tried to write a letter to his father, knowing it would never be sent, writing it anyway because he needed to put words to what he was feeling. He wrote about the Banzai charge, about the artillery that never stopped, about the supplies they had found in the American position. He wrote about counting the explosions and realizing they came faster than a man could run, that courage meant nothing against coordinated industrial firepower. He tried to explain how everything they had been taught about sacrifice and strength was backwards, that poverty did not make warriors strong, it just made them poor. The hardest part to write was the question that kept him awake at night. If Americans were this strong while also being comfortable, while also being well-fed and well-supplied, then what did that mean about Japan's entire philosophy? They had been told that suffering built character, that hardship created superior soldiers, that wanting comfort was weakness. But the Americans wanted comfort and still fought harder, produced more, coordinated better. They had built a system where soldiers could be strong without being starved, where power came from factories instead of from willingness to die. Takeda tore up the letter before finishing it. The questions it asked were too dangerous, the answers too devastating. But he could not tear up the thoughts themselves. They stayed with him, growing stronger each day, a crack in his worldview that kept widening. 2 weeks later, when American forces overran their position, Takeda surrendered along with what remained of his company. He expected execution and had been taught that capture meant eternal shame. Instead, American medics treated his wounds, gave him water, and offered him cigarettes. The guards watched them with professional boredom, not hatred or contempt. Even in capture, even in defeat, the Americans had enough resources to show mercy. That final contrast completed the transformation that had begun with 8 shells per second in the darkness. Everything he had believed about power and dignity and the nature of strength had been wrong, and the truth of it sat heavy in his chest like a stone he would carry forever. Late 1946, Hiroshi Takeda stood on the deck of an American LST transport ship, watching the coast of Japan emerge from the morning mist. The harbor at Yokohama looked like a broken tooth, buildings collapsed into rubble, piers jutting from the water at wrong angles, cranes standing twisted and useless against the gray sky. American occupation forces had rebuilt some of it in their practical way, putting up plain buildings made of metal and wood, structures designed for function rather than beauty. Nothing looked the way he remembered from before the war. The ship was full of returning prisoners, men who had survived captivity and were finally going home. Some stood at the rail with Takeda, staring at the ruined coastline with hollow eyes. Others sat below deck, too exhausted or too afraid to look. They had all changed in different ways, carrying different wounds, but they shared one thing in common. They had seen what the enemy was really like, had lived among them, had learned truths that made going home complicated. Takeda carried a worn canvas rucksack that an American guard had given him. Inside were the things he was bringing back to Japan, physical objects that represented everything he had learned. There was an English textbook, dog-eared and marked with pencil notes from months of study in the POW camp. There were technical manuals about farming, written in simple language with clear diagrams, explaining crop rotation and soil management and how to use fertilizer efficiently. These had been given to him by soldiers from Iowa and Kansas, farm boys who had been drafted into the Marines and spent their spare time talking about wheat yields and rainfall patterns. At the bottom of the rucksack, wrapped carefully in cloth, was a photograph. It showed Takeda standing with 3 American guards outside the POW camp barracks. All 4 men were smiling. The Americans had their arms across each other's shoulders like friends, and Takeda stood among them looking relaxed and almost happy. He had hidden this photograph during the processing to leave the camp, knowing that such images could be dangerous back home. Proof of friendliness with the enemy might be seen as collaboration, as betrayal. But he could not bring himself to throw it away. The knowledge he carried in his mind was heavier than anything in his rucksack. He had learned about mechanization, about tractors that could plow a field in hours instead of days. He had learned about mass production, about assembly lines where workers built complicated machines by doing simple tasks over and over. He had watched American efficiency in everything from kitchen operations to vehicle maintenance, and had seen how systems and organization could multiply human effort beyond what individual courage could achieve. But most importantly, he had learned that Japan's entire understanding of strength had been backwards. The ship docked, and the prisoners filed down the gangway onto Japanese soil. Takeda expected some kind of ceremony, officials greeting them, maybe even speeches about honor and homecoming. Instead, there were just tired clerks with clipboards, checking names and handing out papers that explained where to go for ration cards. The country was too exhausted for ceremonies. Everyone was just trying to survive. He caught a train toward his village, riding in a car with broken windows and wooden seats. The countryside rolled past, and the devastation was everywhere. Cities were flattened. Factories stood as burned shells. Bridges had been blown apart and rebuilt with rope and scrap wood. The rice fields looked thin and poorly tended. The irrigation systems damaged and unrepaired. Takeda saw farmers working with hand tools, old men and women doing labor that young men used to do, because the young men were dead or still hadn't come home. His village appeared smaller than he remembered, shrunken somehow, though the buildings were the same. He walked the dirt road toward his family's farm, his rucksack heavy on his shoulder, trying to prepare words to explain where he had been and what he had learned. Neighbors stared as he passed, but did not call out greetings. A returning soldier was not always a cause for celebration. Some came back broken. Others brought uncomfortable questions about why they had survived when others had died. His father was in the field, trying to work soil that looked exhausted and pale. The old man straightened slowly, his back stiff, his face lined with new wrinkles that made him look ancient. He stared at Takeda for a long moment, as if confirming this was really his son and not a ghost. Then he set down his hoe and walked forward. They stood facing each other, neither sure what to say. "You're home," his father finally said. "Yes," Takeda replied. They did not embrace. That was not their way. Instead, they walked together toward the house, where Takeda's mother appeared in the doorway, her hand covering her mouth, tears starting down her cheeks. She at least allowed herself emotion, pulling Takeda into her arms and holding him like he was still a child. She felt thin against him, lighter than he remembered, her body diminished by years of poor food and hard work. The house was cold and bare. Much of the furniture had been burned for heat during the worst winters. The family ate at a low table with mismatched bowls, and the evening meal was a tiny portion of rice mixed with barley and sweet potato, stretching the rations as far as they could go. Takeda's younger sister, who had been 12 when he left, was now a teenager with old eyes. She served the food without speaking, moving like someone who had learned not to expect much from life. His father asked the expected questions. Had he fought with honor? Had he served the emperor well? Takeda answered carefully, describing battles but not defeats, mentioning courage but not the artillery that made courage meaningless. His father nodded, seeming satisfied with these careful truths. But then Takeda made a mistake. He mentioned the American POW camp, the food they had received, the medical care, the education programs. His father's face hardened. "You should have chosen death," he said quietly. "Surrender brings shame to our ancestors." The words hit Takeda like a physical blow, but they also released something inside him. The anger and frustration he had been holding back came pouring out. "The Americans won because they built wealth before they made war," he said, his voice rising. "We tried to build an empire to gain wealth. We had it backwards, father. Everything is backwards." His father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You speak like a traitor, like they corrupted you." "They showed me the truth," Takeda shot back. "We starved our soldiers and called it discipline. We sent men to die with swords against artillery and called it bravery. We were not strong because we suffered, we just suffered, that's all. The Americans won because they built a system where even common soldiers lived better than our generals. Power comes from abundance, not from sacrifice." The silence that followed was terrible. His mother looked down at her bowl. His sister had stopped eating, frozen in place. His father stood with his fists clenched, his face red with anger or shame or both. Finally he spoke, his voice tight with control. "You were my son. I don't know what you are now." He walked out of the house, out into the dark fields, leaving Takeda alone with his mother and sister. His mother reached across the table and touched his hand gently. "Give him time," she whispered. "The war took many things from us. It even affected the way we understand the world." But Takeda knew that time might not be enough. His father still clung to the old notions of honor and sacrifice, still believed that poverty somehow made men superior. The old man could not see what Takeda had learned, could not accept that everything they had been taught about strength was a lie designed to make weakness feel noble. In the following weeks, Takeda tried to help with the farm, but his suggestions were met with resistance. He explained crop rotation techniques he had learned from the American farmers, but his father insisted on doing things the traditional way. He talked about fertilizer and soil management, but these ideas were dismissed as foreign corruption. The gap between them grew wider each day, a canyon that no amount of explanation could bridge. Yet something unexpected began to happen. Younger people in the village started to seek Takeda out. Boys too young to have fought, but old enough to understand that Japan had lost, would appear at the farm, asking quiet questions. What were the Americans really like? How did they grow so much food? Why were they so strong? Takeda would sit with them and share what he had learned, carefully at first, then more openly as he realized they were hungry for truth. A neighbor asked him to teach English to his children. Another wanted to understand American farming methods. Slowly, carefully, Takeda began to pass on the knowledge he had brought home, not as propaganda or worship of the enemy, but as practical lessons about efficiency and organization and the power of building systems that worked. He taught them that abundance was better than sacrifice, that feeding your people made them stronger than starving them, that modern war was won by factories and farms long before the first shot was fired. Years passed. The American occupation eventually ended. Japan began to rebuild, not as a military empire, but as something new. Takeda watched as his country slowly, painfully learned the lessons he had learned in that POW camp. Factories opened that built cars instead of weapons. Farms modernized with tractors and fertilizer. Young people studied engineering and business instead of military tactics. The transformation was not quick and not easy, but it was real. By the 1970s, Japan's economic miracle was in full force. Japanese products were being shipped around the world. The factories that had once built weapons now built electronics, cameras, cars that were known for quality and reliability. Takeda, now in his 50s, worked as an agricultural consultant, helping farmers increase their yields using modern methods. He never became famous or important, but he helped his community understand that prosperity came from smart work, not just hard work. His father had died in 1963, never fully accepting the new Japan that was emerging. But before his death, in a rare moment of softness, the old man had admitted that the young people seemed healthier than his generation had been, that full bellies seemed to create strong workers. It was the closest he could come to admitting that Takeda might have been right. Now Takeda had a grandson, a bright boy of 12, who wanted to be an engineer. They sat together one evening, watching television coverage of Japanese factories exporting goods to America, to Europe, to the whole world. The boy asked how Japan had changed so much, how they had gone from defeat to success. Takeda thought carefully before answering. "We learned the wrong lesson first," he said. "We believed that spirit conquers everything, that suffering makes you strong. Then the artillery came. 8 shells per second they fired, maybe more. I never got an exact count. We charged with swords and rifles, believing courage was enough. We were brave, yes, very brave. But they were efficient, and in war, efficiency defeats bravery every single time." The boy listened, his eyes wide. Takeda continued, "We lost because we built the wrong system. We glorified poverty and called it virtue. We celebrated sacrifice and called it strength. But poverty is just poverty, and sacrifice is just loss. The Americans won because they built abundance first, then used that abundance to make war. We tried to make war to gain abundance. The order matters." "But we're strong now," the boy said. "We make good things. We sell them everywhere." "Yes," Takeda agreed, "because we finally learned. Not to copy America, but to understand the principle. Build wealth, build systems, build abundance. Then use those things to make life better, not to make war. That's what I really learned in captivity, though it took years to understand it fully. The truest victory is building a nation where you never need to send soldiers to charge artillery with swords." He pulled out the old photograph, faded now, showing himself with the American guards, all of them smiling. "These men were my enemies," he said. "They guarded me in prison, but they also taught me that the enemy of hunger is food, the enemy of poverty is prosperity, and the enemy of ignorance is knowledge. Those are the only wars worth fighting. Everything else is just young men dying to protect old men's mistakes." His grandson studied the photograph, then looked at his grandfather with new understanding. "Is that why you teach farming? Why do you help people grow more food?" "Yes," Takeda said simply. "I cannot bring back the men who died charging into that artillery. I cannot undo the years Japan spent choosing honor over sense. But I can help make sure we never make those mistakes again. I can teach people that abundance is better than sacrifice, that full stomachs build stronger nations than empty ones filled with pride." He looked out the window at the village, now prosperous, now modern, now so different from the starving place he had returned to in 1946. "They fired 8 shells per second, and we charged with swords. I thought it was a battle between courage and cowardice, but it was really a battle between systems. They had built the right system. We had built the wrong one. The lesson isn't that America was better than Japan. The lesson is that some ways of organizing a society work, and some don't. Choose the ones that work. Feed your people. Build your strength on full rice bowls and busy factories, not on empty stomachs and beautiful speeches about sacrifice. That's what my American captivity taught me. Not submission, just sanity. And sanity, I learned, is the rarest form of strength." He folded the photograph and put it away, a relic from a different world, a reminder of the price of learning lessons the hard way. Outside, the modern world hummed with prosperity bought by painful knowledge. And Hiroshi Takeda, former lieutenant, former prisoner, now just an old man trying to pass on wisdom, hoped that future generations would be smart enough to learn these lessons from stories instead from artillery fire in the darkness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.